What are they? They're primarily public lands. They're at least 5,000 acres in size. The ROS, the Recreation Wilderness Opportunity Spectrums, are pristine and primitive. They're at least 3 miles from the nearest road. Invasive species represent less than 0.1% of the area. There's isolated livestock grazing, no structures or energy or mining, no motorized intrusions, excellent opportunity for solitude. So a couple slides, pre-European settlement conditions, and I know most of you know this. There are billions of forest songbirds, close to 500 million ducks, 3.5 billion passenger pigeons, and 60 million buffalo that roam the grasslands. Lower 48, about 2 billion acres. This is an example of the virgin forest, which constituted about half of it. Grasslands, over 350 million acres on the prairie, Great Plains, and the Intermountain West. Today, looking at disturbance factors, those factors that were most influential in affecting wildlands prior to '64, which was the year of the Wilderness Act, were grazing, farming, deforestation, urbanization were most important. Since 1964, the factors most influential were invasive species, unmanaged motorized recreation, energy, and mining too. Forest fragmentation, over half our remaining forests are small private woodlots surrounded by development or ag lands. In the next few decades, it's estimated that an additional 70 million acres will be developed. This is an interesting stat. We're losing about 6,000 acres of forest a day nationwide. Looking at agriculture, over the last 60 years, we've lost 16 million acres of wetlands and losing close to 60,000 a year. Our conservation reserve program has been declined by 13 million acres the last 10 or 15 years. Here's an example over a 5-year period of acreage that was converted to crops. Oil and gas development. There's currently about 100,000 wells in production or drilling. I spent 6 years of my career up in northwest North Dakota working in the oil patch, and if you look at the Bakken oil field in the upper or in the lower slide, that footprint is greater than the Twin Cities metro area. And I calculated about 80 million acres are affected either the solitude or physical displacement from energy development in the lower 48. Invasive plants, I researched, I talked with a lot of folks and calculated about 50 million acres of invasive plants, most of it out west. When you consider that only a third of actual infestations are discovered, and you factor in private lands, estimated 120 million acres of wildlands are infested by invasive species. I spent 12 years in central Idaho in the Frank Church Wilderness as an invasive species coordinator, and we had a problem with yellow star thistle coming over from Oregon. Here's just an example in kudzu in the southern forests. Mining, there's about 8.5 million acres of coal mines out west, 1 million acres in Appalachia, 150 hard rock operations in operation. Calculated about 16 million acres of our wildlands are affected by either the solitude from the noise or the physical impact. Example of coal mines in West Virginia, copper nickel mine in Utah. An Arizona copper nickel mine, 20-mile footprint. This doesn't include the impacts of solitude from the noise that you could hear for miles from one of these operations. And looking at Minnesota, if you look today, our existing mines, the Iron Range, there's about a 45-mile line where you could be within the sight and sound of mining operations. When you add sulfide mining to that, polymet, twin metals, you could be within the 75-mile line where you could be in the sight and sounds of mining, with the smokestacks, the noise of the big crushers and so forth, explosions. With the mines in Minnesota, if they do go in, you're looking at a lot of jobs. That's a lot of people. They're going to move into the area, and they're going to need places to live, and you could expect residential development and associated activities with the large increase in population. This is one aspect of mining that's not talked about much. It's usually the impacts to water and so forth. Looking at wildlife as it relates to mining, twin metals, most of their leases are within Rainy Lake watershed. And the Rainy Lake watershed comprises about 1% of the geographic area of Minnesota, but yet constitutes 16% of our rare species occur within that. So there's disproportional importance to that area from a wildlife habitat standpoint. Other disturbance factors, the national scale calculated 30 million acres affected by off-highway vehicles, livestock grazing. I spent 15 years of my career as a rangeland manager and worked a lot on western rangelands and seen some pretty hammered areas. Urban sprawl, 40 million acres of wildlands affected. So from that 2 billion acres, we're looking at about 162 million unmodified wildlands remain today. Putting that over time, pre-settlement, 2 billion acres cut in half by 1900, 560 million by the year of the Wilderness Act, 64, 92% gone today, and if current trends continue, 2% of the lower 48 would be that unmodified wildlands would remain. One metric I use is the acres per person, and that's a function of the land area, the size, as well as the population. Calculated in 1900, there were about 12.5 acres of unmodified wildland per person, dropped down to 3 in 64, a half acre of unmodified wildland today. If trends continue, 1/10 of an acre of unmodified wildlands remaining. Lindsay, what I wanted to do is just get an idea of, in my family generation, the loss of wildlands. These are actually my great-grandparents. 1890s calculated 1.3 billion acres. These are my grandparents, 950 million. My dad's generation, 500 million. My generation, 350 million acres left. My kids' generation, 160. And by the time my grandkids are in their 30s, there'll be about 40 million acres of unspoiled and modified wildlands left in the lower 48. Despite what's going on in the political climate, it doesn't seem to recognize this. Under the current administration, there's been huge rollbacks. And the most recent one I'm sure everybody's familiar with is a couple weeks ago, the rollback of the endangered species protections. So I guess the take-home message is if you're working on a project back home, recognize that sulfide mines may be developed in northern Minnesota, frac sand mining in the southeast, wetlands are being drained in the southwest, CRP is being plowed in the northwest, urban sprawl is expanding, as is invasive species, forest insects and disease, and so forth. And so it's trying to incrementally look at these and look at it cumulatively. So with that, we'll be looking at introducing our speakers. But before I do, I'd just like to share with you some little known facts about our speakers. Years ago, they attended a natural resource conference in Liverpool, England. That's where they met. Not only do they have brilliant scientific and journalistic minds, they were creative in other aspects too, including their songwriting abilities. You didn't know this, did you? I didn't know it until recently either. They called themselves the Leopoldals. Shortly after that, they recorded an album, and they called it Sgt. Pepper's Natural Resource Club Band. Here they are. They were kind of moonlighting, but they were famous before I knew about it, and I'm sure you guys too. And so, with that, let me introduce to you our first speaker, Dan Starsky.